In the last segment, I tried to complicate the simple-minded narrative of white people, slave owners, black people, slaves, by pointing to the presence of 3,500 black slave owners in America, free blacks who owned collectively more than 10,000 black slaves. In this segment, I want to talk about the distinction between race on the one hand and skin color on the other. We tend to think of these two as the same. And we hear all kinds of nonsense about really both. I hear things like race is a social construct. Well, no, it's not. At least it's not purely a social construct. Any more than skin color is a social construct. Well, Dinesh, the fact that you're brown is a social construct. You're not really brown. That's just society decided to label you as brown. No, I actually am brown. It's not a social invention. This is actually a biological fact. It may be socially acknowledged or denied, but that's a whole different matter. Now, people also say things, and I see this in the literature all the time. There's no such thing as a pure race. There's no such thing as pure races just don't exist. There are no fixed categories of race. This is actually not true. The proof is that I am, in fact, a pure-blooded Asian Indian. How do I know this? Because my daughter has done her ancestral DNA, and it shows that 50% of her DNA is Indian, which makes me 100% Indian. No admixture, apparently. Now, admittedly, Indian or Asian Indian is not a race, but the point I want to make is that whatever race I am, I'm not mixed. Now, let's consider the very interesting case of me and Debbie. Because if you were to look at just color, just look at us on first glance, it would appear that I am a person of color, I'm brown, and she's white. That's how it looks to the, you may say, to the naked eye. It would seem to follow that I am sort of Asian by race and that she is Caucasian. But here's the problem. Asian is not a race. If you take people as different as the Indians and the Chinese, completely different looks, appearance, completely different features. In fact, to be honest, not even much of a common history. So we're stuck in the same continent, but that's a geographical location. That's not a biological designation. The simple truth is that there are, and this is there's a whole scholarly literature on this, there are really three races in the world. And I'm going to use that kind of old names because this is how they were put forward really many decades ago. There's the Caucasian race. There's the Negroid race, that's the technical term for it, and the Oriental race. And sometimes people use other names for it, but the most common is in fact Oriental. Now, these terms are a little dated, as I say, but nevertheless, there are prominent anthropologists and biologists like Vincent Sarich at Berkeley who say, listen, these are valid categories. They're not social constructs, and the proof of it is this. If you take 100 people, and let's just say you kind of strip them naked, and then you bring in people and say, listen, can you divide these 100 people accurately into these three groups, Caucasian, Negroid, and Oriental? Sarich goes, of course you can. Anybody can. It's so easy to do. There's going to be hardly a mistake about it. And we're talking, by the way, not about people who are mixed race, but people who belong to one or another of these groups. Now, what about the American Indians? What race do they belong to? Well, racially, they belong to the Oriental group. What was sometimes called the Mongolian or the Mongoloid group. Why? Because it was the Mongolian people who apparently crossed over the Bering Strait many, many thousands of years ago and came to the Americas, and that's the ancestral roots of the Native Americans. You'll notice that there are people in Africa, in places like Egypt, think of like Anwar Sadat, for example, who are dark-skinned, but who are not Negroid in their features. So what race do they belong to? Well, they belong to the Caucasian race. Why? Because they're not Oriental and they're not Negroid, which leaves only one race, the Caucasian race. I was myself a little puzzled to find out when I first looked into this. Asian Indians are members of the Caucasian race. Again, we shouldn't confuse race and skin color. Asian Indians are all kinds of colors. They go from really white to black. And by white, I mean as white, if not whiter than American whites. And I mean as black, if not blacker than American blacks. If you look, for example, a lot of Bollywood actresses, you'll notice they're very light-skinned. They look European. They don't even look Indian, but they are Indian. They're just very light-skinned Indians. And I think on the Indian spectrum, I would fall somewhere exactly in the middle. Now, here's the funny thing. Even though I would be racially, quote, Caucasian, kind of funny, Debbie is not, or at least not entirely. Debbie did her DNA Ancestry.com, and she discovered that she's about 75% white. And by white, I mean here ancestry in places like Portugal and Spain and Italy, also a little bit in France. But she's 12%, is it 12?
13% native.
She's 13% native,
and 10%.
and she's 10% black. And by black, I mean with ancestry in places like the Cameroon and where else? Nigeria?
Congo, Nigeria.
The Congo, Nigeria.
Senegal.
Now, you might say, how the heck did this happen, Debbie? You seem to have had some very adventurous ancestors. Well, Debbie's dad is Venezuelan, but he grew up in the Dominican Republic. And the Dominican Republic is majority black, so there's some black ancestry there. And Debbie's mom is Mexican-American. She grew up in the Rio Grande Valley, which of course used to be part of Mexico. This was also Indian country, and so that's where the Indian heritage comes from. So the great irony at the end of the day is that although Debbie sort of looks white and I look brown, the simple truth of it is I'm more Caucasian than she is. She's smiling here. I'm 100% and she's 75%. So I'm only mentioning all this because I want to show a distinction between race and color. The weird thing is, in a sense, if you confuse race and color, if you think color is the same as race, if a Caucasian means white, then technically Debbie is a person of color and I'm not. Now, of course, that's absurd. And the point I want to make at the end of the day is all of this, while interesting, I find it interesting, is also kind of irrelevant. And by irrelevant, what I mean is it should be morally irrelevant and it should be legally irrelevant. Why? Because at the end of the day, what does all this matter? We are all in the world, in the end, a minority of one. We're individuals. And it's celebrating that individuality and celebrating not so much what we are as who we become, what we make of ourselves, what we can do. At the end of the day, it is that difference that makes all the difference.